Chapter 1: The Great Thirst. The Land Rover's engine complained, a high whining protest against the oppressive heat and the fine silicate dust that worked its way into every mechanical joint. Inside the cabin, the air conditioning fought a losing battle, managing only to circulate a tepid, plastic-scented breeze. Dr. Kenna O'Connell stared through the shimmering distortion rising from the bonnet, her eyes fixed on the horizon. It was less a line and more a suggestion, a place where the pale, sun-bleached sky bled into an ocean of ochre sand. "Are you certain of the coordinates, Jafari?" Kenna's voice was crisp, cutting through the drone of the engine. She did not turn her head. Jafari Adebyo, seated in the passenger seat, tapped a stylus against the screen of a ruggedized tablet. The device was mounted on the dashboard, displaying a topographic map overlaid with satellite imagery. "The geodata is precise, Kenna. We are less than 5 kilometers from the primary site. The long-wave scans from the university satellite were unmistakable. There's a density anomaly right where the old German prospector's journal indicated." "An anomaly," Kenna repeated, the word tasting like sand in her mouth. She had built this expedition, this entire year of her life, on that single word. She had begged for funding, called in favors she couldn't afford to repay, and assembled a team based on little more than a dead man's century-old ramblings and a few ghostly shadows on a satellite scan. An anomaly. It had to be more. In the seat behind her, Dr. Ben Carter cleaned his glasses for the third time in an hour. He was a man of immense patience, a trait essential for someone who spent his life coaxing secrets from bone and desiccated tissue. The desert, however, tested even his limits. The heat index must be approaching 50 Celsius. Any exposed equipment will start to fail. "The sensitive gear stays packed until we make camp," Kenna said. "Zara is right behind us with the supply truck. She knows the protocols." A series of sharp clicks and a low, guttural sound came from the third person in the back seat. Guxa, not equal to Oma, their guide, pointed a long, bony finger past Kenna's shoulder. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes dark and deep-set, holding a stillness that seemed to defy the brutal environment. He pointed toward a colossal shape that was slowly resolving itself from the heat haze. It was the dune. They called it the spook dune in the old Afrikaans vernacular. The ghost dune. Guxa, however, used a different name, spoken in the clicking tongue of the San people. He called it letter 1C2 Ka Kaiko, the Great Thirst. It rose from the flat pan of the desert floor like the flank of a sleeping god. It was immense, a mountain of sand sculpted by millennia of relentless wind, its crest a sharp, serpentine line against the washed-out blue of the sky. As they drew closer, they began to hear it. It was not a sound carried on the wind, but a vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, resonating up through the tires and the chassis of the vehicle. A low, continuous hum. Jafari leaned forward, his eyes wide with academic excitement. "There it is, the famous song, incredible. The resonance is even stronger than the literature suggests." He unclipped a handheld audio recorder and aimed its directional microphone toward the dune. The digital display showed the input levels pulsing steadily. "It sounds like a generator," Ben murmured from the back, peering out the window. "A massive one." It sings for what it wants, Guxa said. The words were quiet, yet they filled the cabin. Kenna glanced at the guide in the rearview mirror. What does it want, Guxa? Water, the old man replied, his expression unreadable. It drinks the voice from your throat. It drinks the memory from your head, leaves you quiet, leaves you empty. Jafari chuckled, a nervous but dismissive sound. Fascinating folklore. The prevailing theory is intergranular friction. Trillions of grains of sand, all containing quartz, sliding over one another. It creates a piezoelectric effect, amplified by the dune's specific shape and internal structure. A big guitar made of sand, Kenna summarized, her focus returning to the task of navigating the treacherous terrain. She preferred Jafari's explanation. It was clean, scientific. It could be measured and quantified. Guxa's words were unsettling, a thread of superstition she had no time to entertain. They found a suitable location for the base camp a kilometer from the dune's base, on a patch of ground that was more baked clay than shifting sand. The supply truck, a monstrous six-wheel drive vehicle, arrived 20 minutes later, piloted by Zara Venter. She leaped from the cabin, a tall, powerfully built woman with short-cropped hair and a demeanor that radiated competence. Behind her, a mountain of a man named Cadnan Rue, or Rhino, climbed out of the passenger side, a heavy rifle slung over his shoulder. "All clear," Rhino announced, his voice a gravelly boom. He scanned the empty horizon. "Nothing out here but us and the big pile of dirt." "It's not dirt," Jafari corrected him automatically. "It's predominantly silicate particulates with a high concentration of feldspar and—" Rhino just grunted and began unstrapping equipment from the truck bed. The team worked with practiced efficiency under Zara's direction. Inflatable, heat-shielded tents blossomed from the packed earth. A solar array was unfurled to power the camp's core systems. Ben immediately began setting up a climate-controlled medical and analysis tent, his sanctuary of order amidst the chaos of the desert. Kenna, however, had no time for camp duties. She grabbed the ground-penetrating radar unit, a device that looked like a futuristic lawnmower, and strode toward the dune. Jafari hurried after her with his tablet, ready to receive the data stream. "You go to it," Guxa said as she passed. He was sitting in the sliver of shade offered by the supply truck, sharpening a knife on a smooth stone. "You do not wait for it to come to you, a poor guest." Kenna ignored him. The hum grew louder as she approached the base of the sand mountain. It was a physical presence now, a pressure against her eardrums. The air was thick with it. She started her first pass, walking a precise grid pattern along the dune's gently sloping base. The GPR unit sent pulses of radio waves into the sand, and Jafari watched the results render on his screen. For an hour there was nothing. The display showed the expected stratigraphy of the dune, layers of compacted sand, a deep bedrock of granite. It was exactly what one would expect to find. Kenna's jaw tightened. Her funders expected more than geological conformity. "Let's try the southern face," she said, her voice tight with frustration. The journal mentioned a formation of black rock like a dragon's teeth. They relocated, the sun beating down relentlessly. Rhino followed them at a distance, a self-appointed guardian, while Ben and Zara continued to establish the camp. Guxa did not move from his spot in the shade. They found the rocks an hour later. A jagged outcrop of dark, weathered basalt protruded from the sand, just as the old prospector had described. The hum seemed different here, subtly modulated, with a discordant undertone that was almost musical. "This is the spot," Kenna said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through her fatigue. "I can feel it. Scan again, Jafari." She began a new grid pattern. Jafari watched the tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. The first few passes showed nothing new. Then he stopped. "Kenna," he said, his voice quiet, "you should see this." She walked over, peering at the screen over his shoulder. Her breath caught in her throat. Deep beneath the surface, perhaps 10 meters down, the GPR was painting a picture. It was not a random geological formation. It was an image of impossible order. Dozens of distinct, oblong shapes were arranged in a perfect, tiered crescent. They were uniformly sized, spaced with geometric precision, all facing a single, larger object at the crescent's center. It looked like an amphitheater, or a congregation. "What is that?" Jafari whispered, tracing the shapes on the screen with his finger. "The density readings are consistent with organic material, mummified remains, but this many, arranged like this, it's unheard of." Kenna stared at the image, her heart hammering against her ribs. The old man's journal hadn't just been rambling. The satellite anomaly wasn't a glitch. This was it. This was the discovery that would make her name. She knelt, placing her hand on the warm sand directly above the buried formation. The deep, resonant hum of the dune vibrated through her palm, a low and patient thrumming. It felt like a greeting. It felt like an invitation. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and something else, something she refused to name. "We start the dig tomorrow at dawn." From a kilometer away, Guxa watched them. He saw Kenna kneel. He saw the way she touched the sand. He put his knife away and drew a complex symbol in the dust with his finger, a sign of warding. He knew the dune was not singing to the newcomers. It had found its new instruments. Now it was merely tuning them. The real song had not yet begun. Chapter 2: The Obsidian Larynx. Dawn in the Namib was a quiet, violent event. The sun did not rise. It ignited, banishing the cold of the night in a brutal wave of heat. The dig began before the camp was fully awake. Kenna, driven by a feverish energy, had already marked out the excavation site with flags and string, a perfect rectangle on the face of the dune. Rhino stood guard, his rifle held loosely, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats he could understand. Poachers, rival survey teams. He saw none. The only movement was the slow, inexorable crawl of shadows as the sun climbed higher. Ben Carter arrived with his toolkit, his expression one of professional concern. "Kenna, a 10-meter excavation in loose sand is incredibly dangerous. The walls will collapse. We need shoring timbers, support frames. We don't have the equipment for a deep dig of this nature." "We're not digging a mine shaft, Ben," Kenna countered, her voice sharp. She pointed to the base of the basalt rocks. "We're digging here at an angle following the bedrock down. The rock will be our support wall. We'll use the sand we excavate to build up the other sides. It's a sound approach. It's a reckless approach, Ben stated, but he saw the look in her eyes. There was no arguing with her. He sighed and knelt, scooping up a handful of sand. I'll get the soil sample kits. Jafari was a whirlwind of motion, setting up a perimeter of sophisticated audio sensors. He planted parabolic microphones on tripods, all aimed at the heart of the dune. He ran cables to a central monitoring station in his tent, his face alight with the thrill of pure research. If the excavation changes the internal structure, it could alter the dune's acoustic properties. I want to document every subtle frequency shift. This is groundbreaking. Guxa sat apart from the main group near the basalt outcrop. He did not watch the team, he watched the dune itself. He saw the way the wind, which should have been blowing from the east, seemed to eddy and curl around the dig site, as if the air itself was hesitant to disturb the sand. He saw a pair of jackals on a distant ridge, sitting and watching, silent and still as statues. They did not act like normal animals. The work was grueling. The sun was a physical weight. Under Kenna's relentless direction, a team of locally hired laborers shoveled sand. The rhythm of the dig was set by the scrape of their spades and Kenna's sharp commands. By midday, they had dug a deep, sloping trench into the side of the dune. Zara moved between the diggers, forcing them to drink water, her face a mask of grim efficiency. It was Lena Sharma, the graduate student, who made the first find. Her shovel struck something that wasn't sand or rock, a soft, scraping sound. "Dr. O'Connell," she called out, her voice a mixture of excitement and nerves. Kenna was there in an instant, pushing past the laborers. "Everyone out. Ben, get your brushes." The object was wrapped in what looked like cured animal hide, dark and brittle with age. It was one of the oblong shapes from the GPR scan. As Ben gently brushed away the sand, the full form was revealed. It was a human body, but its posture was bizarre. It was seated, its back unnaturally straight, its head tilted upward, its mouth open in a silent cry. "Extraordinary preservation," Ben muttered, his earlier concerns momentarily forgotten in the face of the discovery. The aridity. It's a natural desiccation. A mummy. As he cleared more sand, the true strangeness of the artifact became apparent. The figure was bound to a simple ironwood frame to hold its seated posture. Its skin was not tattooed, but was covered in a spiraling pattern of fine, dark lines. "Are those scars?" Lena asked, leaning closer. "No," Ben said, using a pair of forceps to lift a tiny fragment. "This isn't skin. Not exactly. It's been flayed and cured. It's parchment. Human parchment. And the lines, they're glyphs, some kind of writing." A cold silence fell over the dig site. The hum from the dune seemed to deepen, to settle into a lower, more ominous frequency. Jafari, listening on his headphones from the edge of the pit, frowned and adjusted the gain on his equipment. "There are more," Kenna said, her voice a hushed command. "Find the others." The discovery of the first mummy opened a floodgate. Within the next 2 hours, they uncovered 4 more, all identical. Seated, bound to frames, mouths open, bodies covered in the spiraling, glyph-like text. They formed a perfect arc, the beginning of the crescent from the GPR scan. A chorus of scriveners, Ben silently dubbed them. He moved from one mummy to the next, his scientific curiosity warring with a growing sense of revulsion. The craftsmanship was as meticulous as it was monstrous. He knew, without a doubt, that this was not a burial. It was a construction. These people had been turned into objects. "Kenna, I need to get one of these to the analysis tent," Ben said, standing up and wiping sweat from his brow. "I need to do a proper examination, an endoscopy at least." "No," Kenna replied instantly. "They stay in situ. We document them here. Nothing gets moved until we've uncovered the entire formation. That's the protocol." "This isn't a normal find," Ben argued, his voice rising. "Look at them. This is a scene, a tableau. Moving one could compromise the integrity of the entire assembly." "My decision is final," Kenna snapped. Their argument was cut short by a shout from Rhino. "We've got company." He was pointing his rifle toward the shimmering horizon. Two vehicles were approaching, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. They were official-looking trucks, with the emblem of the Namibian Ministry of Antiquities on the doors. A woman with a stern face and a clipboard, Imara Diop, was the first to emerge. She surveyed the scene, the deep, unsupported trench, the unearthed mummies, Kenna's defiant expression, and her lips thinned into a hard line. "Dr. O'Connell," Imara said, her voice devoid of warmth, "your permit is for a surface survey and limited sample collection only. This is an unauthorized full-scale excavation. You are endangering the site and your people." "This is the find of a lifetime," Kenna shot back, gesturing to the seated mummies. "I wasn't going to wait for a committee in Windhoek to approve a paperwork amendment." "The find of a lifetime will be shut down and confiscated if you do not follow procedure," Imara stated flatly. She walked to the edge of the pit, looking down at the mummies. A flicker of something, not quite fear but a deep unease, crossed her face. "What are they?" "We're still assessing," Ben interjected, trying to smooth things over. "The preservation is remarkable. They appear to be part of a larger, ritualistic arrangement." Imara was not placated. She walked the perimeter of the site, making notes on her clipboard. She spoke in low, rapid tones with her own staff. The tension was thick enough to taste. The dig had stopped. The laborers stood around uncertainly. Kenna paced back and forth like a caged animal. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the sand, a compromise was reached. Imara would allow the dig to continue under her strict supervision, on the condition that Ben be allowed to take one of the mummies for a preliminary, non-destructive analysis. Kenna agreed, her frustration barely concealed. They chose the first mummy they had uncovered. It took 4 people to carefully lift the seated figure, frame and all, from its sandy tomb. As they moved it, a small, dark object, dislodged from the mummy's open mouth, fell onto the sand. Lena picked it up. It was a smooth, black stone, like a piece of polished obsidian, but it was carved. It was shaped with an eerie, anatomical precision. It looked like a human larynx. Ben took it from her, his eyes widening. He brought a portable light closer. "It's not a replacement," he whispered, a horrified realization dawning on him. It's a reinforcement. The cartilage of the original larynx has been coated in some kind of resin and fused with this stone. Why would anyone do this? It's it's like they were building a musical instrument inside a person's throat. He looked from the stone in his hand to the other mummies, still sitting in their silent, crescent formation in the trench. He looked at their open mouths and their gazes fixed on the unseen sky. From deep within the dune, the humming sound shifted again. A new note emerged, a higher, resonant tone that overlaid the deep bass drone. It was clearer, more focused. Jafari, still monitoring his equipment, ripped his headphones off. His face was pale. "What is it?" Kenna demanded. "The new frequency," Jafari said, his voice unsteady. "It's not random. It's a perfect harmonic overtone of the bass frequency. It's as if something was listening and is now trying to tune itself to us." Guxa stood and walked to the edge of the camp, staring into the deepening twilight. He spoke to no one in particular. "They have unwrapped the gifts. Now the host will sing its thanks." Chapter 3: The Central Dais. The analysis tent was an island of sterile white light in the vast, encroaching darkness of the desert. Inside, the mummy sat on a reinforced table, its vacant stare and open mouth a silent centerpiece of dread. Ben Carter worked with a quiet, intense focus, his movements precise and economical. The tent was sealed against the dust, the air chilled by a portable air conditioner that rattled in protest against the night's residual heat. Lena assisted him, her hands trembling slightly as she passed him instruments. "Endoscope camera is ready," she said, her voice a little too loud in the confined space. Ben took the thin, flexible camera and gently guided it into the mummy's open mouth. On a monitor beside them, a grainy, magnified image appeared. He navigated past desiccated gums and a blackened tongue that was as hard as wood. Then he pushed the lens deeper into the throat. "My God," he breathed. Lena leaned closer to the screen, a hand flying to her own mouth. The image was of something both organic and artificial. The mummy's vocal cords were still there, but they were stretched taut, almost to the breaking point, and pinned in place by thin, black obsidian spikes. The entire larynx, just as he suspected from the stone he'd found, was coated in a dark, glossy resin, reinforcing it, turning the delicate structure of cartilage into something as rigid as stone. The hollow of the chest cavity, visible further down, seemed unnaturally large. "He was right," Ben murmured, pulling the scope out. "The prospector's journal. It mentioned the local tribes feared the dune, said it could steal a man's voice and make it its own. They believed the only way to appease it was with a gift, an offering of a perfect voice." He looked at the mummy. They weren't offering it a singer. They were offering it an amplifier. He turned his attention to the glyphs on the mummy's parchment-like skin. With a high-resolution digital camera, he took dozens of photos, uploading them directly to Jafari, who was in the communications tent, cross-referencing them against every known database of African petroglyphs and archaic scripts. Outside, the main camp was a hive of nervous energy. Imara Diop and her team had set up their own small camp nearby, a clear statement of their intention to oversee every move. Kenna was in the trench with floodlights, supervising the continued, careful excavation around the crescent formation. She was determined to uncover the central point, the focus of the choir's arrangement. The dune's hum was a constant, oppressive presence. It had settled into the two-toned drone Jafari had identified, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the bones, making teeth ache and vision swim at the edges. Rhino paced the camp's perimeter, his rifle now held tight against his shoulder. He kept glancing at the silent, watching jackals on the ridge. They hadn't moved since sunset. Their eyes seemed to catch the electric light of the camp, glowing with a cold, unnatural luminescence. "This is wrong," Rhino said to Zara as she handed him a cup of coffee. "Animals don't act like this. They should be scavenging or long gone." "Nothing about this place is right," Zara replied, her gaze fixed on the deep trench Kenna had carved into the dune. "She's digging a grave and she's too stubborn to see it." In the communications tent, Jafari stared at his screen, a growing sense of disbelief on his face. "It's not a language," he said to himself. He was on a satellite call with a colleague at Oxford, a leading symbologist. "Then what is it?" The professor's voice crackled through the speakers. "It's musical notation," Jafari said, his excitement overriding his fear. "But it's like nothing I've ever seen. It's polyphonic, incredibly complex. Each glyph represents a specific frequency, duration, and amplitude. The body. The whole body is the score. And these mummies, they're not identical. The patterns are different on each one. They're meant to produce different sounds, harmony, counterpoint." A shout came from the trench. "We've found it, the center." Kenna's voice was triumphant. Everyone rushed to the edge of the pit. The laborers had cleared the sand from the focal point of the crescent. It was not another seated mummy. It was a dais, a low, circular platform of the same black basalt as the nearby outcrop, and upon it lay a single, much larger sarcophagus. It was not made of wood or stone, but of a strange, amber-like resin, semi-translucent. Inside, a shape was visible, dark and still. "Get it open," Kenna commanded, her eyes blazing. It took 4 of the laborers using pry bars to crack the resin seal. The material was unnaturally tough. When it finally gave way, it was with a sickening crack, and a puff of stale, ancient air washed over them, carrying a scent of dried herbs, dust, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. The mummy inside was different. It was larger, taller than the others. It was not seated but laid flat on its back, its arms crossed over its chest. Its face was covered by a funerary mask made not of gold, but of polished obsidian. Its mouth, however, was uncovered, and it too was open. Ben, who had emerged from the analysis tent, pushed his way to the front. He shone a powerful flashlight onto the new mummy. "Look at its chest." Unlike the others, this one's chest cavity was not just hollowed. It had been systematically carved out and then restructured. Thin, curved pieces of ironwood had been set into the ribcage, forming a shape reminiscent of the body of a cello. Stretched across this frame were thick, dark cords of what looked like preserved animal sinew. It was a resonance chamber, a massive, grotesque sound box built inside a human torso. This was not just another instrument. This was the master instrument, the conductor. As Ben's light played over the conductor's open mouth, something inside glinted. He leaned closer, his medical curiosity overriding all else. Deep in the throat, where the larynx should be, was a complex latticework. It was not a simple stone reinforcement. It was an intricate construction of stretched sinew, carved bone, and razor-sharp obsidian flakes, arranged in a way that could catch the slightest vibration and amplify it 100-fold. At that exact moment, as if triggered by the revealing light, the hum of the dune changed once more. The deep bass drone and the harmonic overtone were joined by a third sound. It was a high-frequency pulse, a rapid, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum that felt less like a sound and more like a drill boring into the skull. Jafari stumbled out of his tent, clutching his head. It's happening again, a new signal. Inside the analysis tent, Lena Sharma, who had been left to pack away the equipment, screamed. A piercing, terrified shriek. Ben and Zara spun around and ran for the tent. They found her backed into a corner, her face white with terror, pointing a trembling finger at the first mummy. The mummy, still seated on the examination table, had not moved, not an inch, but a fine stream of sand was trickling from its open mouth, spilling onto the table and the floor. It was the same reddish ochre sand as the dune. It was vibrating, Lena stammered, tears streaming down her face. The whole table was shaking. I heard a grinding sound from inside its chest. Ben approached the mummy cautiously. The sand was still flowing, a silent, impossible hourglass. He looked at its throat, at the obsidian-reinforced larynx, and understood. The dune was no longer just broadcasting a signal. It had found its receivers. It was feeding them. It was filling them. From his command post in the communications tent, Jafari watched in horror as the neat, orderly waveforms on his screen dissolved into chaos. The new pulsing frequency was overwhelming his sensors, but it wasn't just noise. He isolated the pattern and ran it through a translation algorithm. It wasn't music. It wasn't language. It was a firing sequence, an activation code. He grabbed the radio. "Kenna, get everyone away from the trench. Now, it's not just a song, it's a..." His words were cut off by a sound that was not the dune. It was a low, guttural grinding, amplified as if through a microphone. It came from the trench. It came from the resin sarcophagus. It came from the conductor. Its chest cavity was vibrating visibly, the sinew strings humming with a terrible energy. The obsidian mask cracked, a thin fracture running from temple to jaw. The sound grew louder, a bass note so powerful it shook the ground. And in response from the dozen seated mummies in the crescent, a faint, rustling, sandy whisper began. They were waking up. Chapter 4: The Activation Frequency. The world dissolved into sound. The bass note booming from the conductor's chest was not merely heard. It was a physical assault. It struck the dig team like a concussive wave, staggering them. The floodlights flickered, their filaments vibrating in sympathy. Loose tools rattled on the ground. The very air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on them, making it difficult to breathe. Kenna fell to her knees, her hands clamped over her ears. It did no good. The sound wasn't entering through her ears. It was resonating directly in her bones, in the fluid of her eyes, in the chambers of her heart. Her vision blurred, the edges darkening. From the seated mummies in the crescent, the sandy whisper grew into a dry, rasping hiss. The sand that had been pouring from the first mummy in the tent was now streaming from the mouths of the entire choir. It flowed from them like dry blood, pooling at their feet, the individual grains skittering and dancing on the trench floor as if alive. "Fall back," Rhino bellowed, his voice barely audible over the din. He grabbed Lena, who was frozen in place, and hauled her away from the edge of the pit. "To the vehicles, now." His training kicked in, a lifetime of dealing with tangible threats overriding the sensory chaos. He shoved laborers toward the camp, his presence a small island of order in the rising panic. Imara Diop and her staff were already retreating, their faces masks of disbelief and terror. Bureaucracy had no protocol for an archaeological site that had begun to scream at them. In the communications tent, Jafari frantically tried to make sense of the data flooding his screens. The sound wasn't just loud, it was complex, layered. The conductor was emitting the primary low frequency, the activation signal. The choir, in response, was producing a cascade of higher frequencies, the hissing of the sand grains creating a wall of white noise. But beneath it, his sensors were picking up something else, a dozen distinct, faint tones. Each mummy in the choir was beginning to resonate at its own specific pitch, just as the glyphs on their bodies had indicated. They were tuning themselves. "It's a feedback loop," Jafari yelled into the radio, knowing no one could hear him. "The dune sends the signal, the conductor amplifies it, the choir responds, and their response alters the dune's signal. It's a conversation." Ben and Zara reached the analysis tent. The first mummy was still seated, but the pile of sand around it had grown into a small dune of its own. The entire tent was vibrating, the metal frame groaning in protest. "We have to get out of here," Zara yelled, pulling Ben by the arm. Ben's eyes were locked on the mummy. The sand was not just falling from its mouth. It was being forced out. The mummy's desiccated torso was visibly contracting and expanding, a grotesque parody of breathing. The obsidian-laced vocal cords were vibrating so intensely they produced a high-pitched whine, like tortured metal. A sudden, violent tremor shook the ground. It was not an earthquake. It was the dune. The entire mountain of sand seemed to shift, to settle, its deep hum intensifying tenfold. The sand on the walls of the trench began to cascade down, not in a random collapse, but in a smooth, flowing sheet, as if the dune itself were reaching down to reclaim its choir. Kenna, still on the ground, looked up. The world swam before her eyes. The scientific certainty that had driven her for years was fracturing, crumbling away like the walls of her ill-conceived trench. She saw the conductor, its obsidian mask now completely shattered, revealing a face beneath, a face contorted in an eternal, soundless scream. The sinew strings in its chest were vibrating into a blur, and from its throat, a visible column of distorted air pulsed with every beat of the deafening sound. The wind began to howl. A sandstorm, which had been a distant threat on the horizon, descended upon them with unnatural speed. It was not a natural weather pattern. The wind swirled around the dig site, creating a vortex of sand and sound, isolating them, cutting them off from the rest of an unsuspecting world. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was blotted out by a churning, angry wall of dust. Guxa stood his ground near the supply truck, his body braced against the wind. He was the only one not panicking. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed as he watched the maelstrom engulf the dig site. He began to chant, a low, rhythmic intonation in his own language, words to placate an angry god, though he knew it was far too late for that. Rhino managed to herd most of the terrified laborers and a shell-shocked Lena toward the relative safety of the Land Rovers. He turned back for Kenna. "Boss, we have to go." He saw her still kneeling, mesmerized by the horror she had unleashed. He started toward her, but a figure blocked his path. It was Ben. "The frequency," Ben yelled over the storm and the sonic assault. "It's the frequency. It's designed to affect organic matter. Jafari, can you broadcast a counter-frequency? White noise, anything." Jafari's voice crackled over Ben's handheld radio, distorted by static and terror. "I can't. The power from the solar array is fluctuating. The pulse is interfering with all our electronics. The lights, the radios, everything is going down." As if on cue, the floodlights illuminating the trench exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the scene into a terrifying strobe effect lit only by the headlamps of the vehicles and flashes of static electricity in the swirling dust. The choir's hissing rose in pitch, becoming a unified, piercing shriek. The sand pouring from their mouths was now a torrent, burying their lower bodies, anchoring them even more firmly to the dune. They were no longer separate objects. They were becoming part of the landscape. Then the conductor changed its song. The deep, steady drone was replaced by something else, a series of distinct, resonant pulses. It sounded like a word, a single, guttural word spoken in a language of stone and ages. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. One of the laborers, a young man who had been scrambling for the trucks, stopped dead. His eyes went wide. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, a trickle of sand poured from his lips. He clawed at his throat, his body convulsing. He fell to the ground, twitching, his body seeming to deflate as sand poured from his mouth, his nose, his ears, forming a rapidly growing pile beneath him. Zara stared in horror. What's happening to him? Ben understood. The frequency wasn't just an activation signal. It was a weapon. The resonance was so perfect, so precisely tuned, it was causing a molecular breakdown. It was turning the water in the man's cells into silicon dioxide. It was turning him into sand from the inside out. "It's not stealing voices," Ben whispered in horrified revelation, finally understanding Guxa's words. "It's replacing them." The conductor spoke its stone word again. Another laborer collapsed. The dune was not killing them. It was harvesting them. Kenna finally broke from her stupor. The sheer, scientific impossibility of what she was witnessing snapped her mind back into focus. This was not a ritual site. It was a machine. An ancient, biological machine of terrifying power, and she had just switched it on. She got to her feet, the wind tearing at her clothes. "The research, the samples," she screamed, her ambition battling her survival instinct. "We can't lose the data." "Damn the data," Rhino roared, finally reaching her and grabbing her arm. "We're leaving." He began to drag her away from the pit, away from the shrieking choir and the pulsing conductor. But it was too late. The sandstorm closed in, a solid wall of churning darkness. The camp was gone, swallowed. The vehicles were phantoms in the gloom. The world was reduced to the trench, the sound, and the suffocating, swirling sand. The ground beneath their feet began to shift, to soften. The dune was waking up. They were no longer standing near it. They were standing on it, and it was hungry. Chapter 5: The Living Labyrinth. The sandstorm was not a storm. It was a cage. The wind did not howl with the mindless fury of nature. It moved with a chilling, deliberate intelligence. It herded them, sculpted the terrain around them, driving them away from the faint, ghost-like lights of the vehicles and back toward the trench. The world became a suffocating vortex of sand and sound, a disorienting nightmare where up and down were meaningless concepts. Visibility dropped to zero. Kenna was separated from Rhino, his grip torn from her arm by a sudden, violent gust. She was alone, blind, and deafened by the sonic assault of the choir and the roar of the sand. She stumbled forward, hands outstretched, trying to find anything solid in the chaos. Her foot caught on something and she fell, her face plunging into the cool, shifting sand. The sound was different here, muffled by the sand but also clearer. It was coming from beneath her. The entire dune was a speaker, a vast, vibrating diaphragm. She pushed herself up, spitting out grit, her ears ringing. The cacophony from the trench was the focal point, but the true source of the power was the colossal entity she was lying upon. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her scientific denial. She scrambled to her feet and tried to run, but the landscape itself fought against her. The ground, which had been firm packed sand, became soft and yielding, sucking at her boots like quicksand. The gentle slopes she remembered were now steep, sliding walls that crumbled as she tried to climb them. The dune was reconfiguring itself, creating a prison of shifting geography. A light flickered nearby. A headlamp. "Ben!" she screamed, her voice a raw tear in her throat. Ben Carter stumbled toward her out of the swirling dust, his glasses gone, one hand pressed to his bleeding ear. "It's the sound," he yelled, his voice thin against the gale. "It's agitating the sand granules into a non-Newtonian fluid state. It can change the viscosity of the ground at will." Before Kenna could process his words, the sand at their feet liquefied. They plunged waist-deep into a sudden pit of loose, churning sand. It was cold, and it pulled at them with a greedy, insistent force. "Keep moving," Ben shouted, his face a pale mask of terror in the beam of his headlamp. "If we stop, it will bury us." They thrashed, swimming through the sand, their movements clumsy and desperate. Elsewhere in the storm, screams echoed, brief, terrified, and quickly silenced. The laborers, Imara's team, they were all trapped in the same living labyrinth. Jafari was in his tent when the main power failed. The sudden silence from his equipment was more terrifying than the noise had been. He was plunged into darkness, the tent fabric groaning and flapping around him. He fumbled for his emergency flashlight, his hands shaking. The pulsing hum of the conductor was a constant, felt deep in his chest. He knew he had to destroy his research. He couldn't let anyone else find this place, couldn't let them make the same mistakes. He grabbed his laptop, intending to smash it, but the tent flap was ripped open. It wasn't the wind. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the swirling sand. It was one of Imara's staff, a man Jafari had shared a coffee with just hours earlier. But his eyes were glassy and unfocused, and his movements were jerky, unnatural. A thin trickle of sand fell from the corner of his mouth. "You have to hear it," the man said, his voice a dry, rasping monotone, a perfect mimicry of the choir's hiss. "The beautiful song." He took a shambling step forward. Jafari scrambled backward, his heart seizing with terror. The dune wasn't just killing them, it was making puppets. Zara and Lena had found shelter in the cab of the supply truck. The vehicle was their fortress, but the sand was piling up against it, the windows already half covered. The sound was a maddening, relentless thrum that made the dashboard vibrate and the windows hum. "We're going to be buried," Lena sobbed, huddled in the passenger seat. "Shut up," Zara commanded, her voice tight but not unkindly. She was scanning the storm through the clearer patches of the windshield, looking for any sign of the others. "Rhino will find us. He'll know to use the truck as a rally point." As if summoned by her words, a shape appeared. Rhino, staggering through the storm, his rifle gone. He pounded on the driver's side door. Zara threw it open, and he collapsed inside, pulling the door shut against the screaming wind. "They're gone," he gasped, his face caked in dust and blood from a cut on his forehead. "The locals, Imara's people, swallowed by the sand. I saw it, the ground it just opened up." He was shaking, the big man's confidence utterly shattered. "And the animals, the jackals." "What about them?" Zara pressed. "They're not running from it," Rhino choked out. "They're coming towards it, walking right into the storm, and their mouths, they were open, they were trying to sing." The horror of his words hung in the cab. The entity wasn't just controlling its mummified choir. It was broadcasting its influence, and anything with ears to hear was susceptible to its call. Back in the shifting sands, Kenna and Ben found Guxa. The old sand guide was not fighting the dune. He was sitting with his back against one of the basalt dragon's teeth, the only solid ground for meters. He was calm, his eyes closed, his lips moving in his silent chant. "Guxa, you have to move," Kenna pleaded, pulling at his arm. He opened his eyes, they were clear, focused. The sound did not seem to affect him. "You cannot run from the ground you stand on," he said simply. He pointed a finger not at the trench, but up toward the peak of the dune, barely visible through the swirling dust. "The song has a heart. The choir is only its mouth. Its heart is a quiet place." Kenna didn't understand, but there was no time. The ground before them buckled. A wall of sand rose up, separating them from the rock, from Guxa. The old man was gone, cut off. Kenna and Ben were alone again, pushed and prodded by the intelligent landscape. The dune was playing with them. It drove them in circles, exhausting them. It created sheer cliffs of sand that they had to scale, only for the crest to dissolve beneath their fingers. It opened sudden, deep pits that they barely avoided. It was a cat toying with mice, and its purr was the soul-shaking thrum of the choir. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, exhausted and dehydrated, Kenna and Ben collapsed at the bottom of a deep bowl the dune had formed around them. The walls were too steep to climb. They were trapped. The sound from the trench lessened slightly. A new sound began, a soft, scraping noise from all around them. Kenna aimed her fatting headlamp beam at the walls of their sand pit. Dozens of figures were emerging from the sand. They were the lost laborers, Imara's staff, their bodies contorted and broken. They were not alive. They were puppets filled with and animated by the dune's consciousness. Their jaws hung slack, and from their mouths poured the same red sand, their bodies little more than sacks for the dune's substance. They began to shamble down the slope, their dead eyes fixed on Kenna and Ben. They were the new choir, the fresh instruments. Ben stared, his scientific mind finally breaking under the weight of the impossible. He began to laugh, a high, unhinged sound. "It's terraforming," he giggled, tears and sand streaking his face. "It's just terraforming. It's making the environment and the inhabitants more suitable for its song." Kenna backed away, pressing herself against the sand wall behind her. This was her legacy. Her name would not be remembered for a great discovery. It would be a footnote in a story of madness and death, a warning scrawled in a dead man's journal. She had not come here seeking a lost civilization. She had stumbled into the lair of a god, and she had given it exactly what it wanted: a new audience and new voices for its eternal, horrifying song. The sand puppets closed in, their scraping feet the only sound as the conductor's pulse fell into a listening silence, waiting for the performance to begin. Chapter 6: The Unsound. The sand puppets advanced. Their movements were a hideous parody of life, a slow, inexorable shuffle that was somehow more terrifying than a sprint. They did not have the speed of predators, but the patience of geology. Kenna dragged Ben backward, his laughter having subsided into a series of quiet, shuddering gasps. The walls of the sand pit offered no escape. It was a grave they had dug for themselves. "They're not trying to touch us," Ben whispered, his eyes wide and fixed on the approaching figures. His mind, though fractured, was still analyzing, still seeing the patterns. "Look at their formations. They are arranging themselves, like the choir." He was right. The dozen or so animated corpses were not swarming them. They were forming a circle around the edge of the pit's floor, their spacing deliberate, precise. They stopped, a ring of dead flesh and whispering sand surrounding the two survivors. Kenna held her breath, expecting a physical attack, a wave of grasping, desiccated hands. It did not come. Instead, they all opened their mouths in perfect, silent unison. The sound that followed was not a sound at all. It was a void, a pressure, a sudden crushing wave of absolute silence that slammed into Kenna and Ben. The ceaseless, maddening thrum of the conductor, the howl of the sandstorm, the hiss of the choir, it all vanished instantly and completely. But this was not the gentle quiet of an empty room. This was an active, aggressive nothingness. Kenna's ears popped violently. A sharp, stabbing pain lanced through her temples. The world went flat, all sense of distance and dimension gone. It was like being plunged deep underwater, the pressure building until she felt her skull would crack. Ben cried out, but his scream was devoured before it left his lips. She saw his mouth open, his face contorted in agony, but the sound was stillborn. He clutched his head, falling to his knees, his body trembling. "Destructive interference," he gasped, the words inaudible but clear on his lips. "They're projecting. A perfect anti-sound. A wave form. 180 degrees out of phase with everything." Kenna understood the physics of it in a detached, academic way. A sound wave and its perfect inverse played together result in zero amplitude, silence. But this was more. The puppets were not canceling the dune's song. They were canceling reality itself within their circle. They were creating a bubble of unsound so profound it was beginning to affect the neurological signals in the brain. Thought itself was a form of resonance, and this was erasing it. Her own thoughts became sluggish, her memories foggy. She tried to recall the plan, the layout of the camp, the names of her team, but the concepts frayed at the edges, dissolving into the crushing silence. The puppets stood motionless, their mouths wide, their dead eyes staring. They were weapons of psychic erosion. She looked at Ben. He was rocking back and forth, a thin line of blood trickling from his nose. His eyes were losing focus, a placid emptiness stealing over him. He was succumbing, his brilliant mind being wiped clean by the sonic void. No, she refused. A primal animal instinct for survival roared to life within her, a force of sheer will against the encroaching null. She would not die here. She would not be erased. She crawled to him, grabbing the front of his shirt. His head lolled. "Ben," she mouthed, her own voice a ghost in her throat. "Fight it, focus on something, anything." She shook him, but he was becoming unresponsive. She needed to break the circle. She looked around, her mind fighting through the cognitive sludge. The puppets were stationary. Their effect was directional, focused inward. If they could just get outside the circle. Her gaze fell on a piece of debris half buried in the sand near the pit wall. It was a long, metal pole from one of the collapsed sensor arrays Jafari had set up. An idea, sharp and desperate, cut through the mental fog. She crawled toward it, the silence pressing down, making every inch a struggle. Her limbs felt heavy, her movements syrupy. The puppets did not react. They were emitters, not sentries. She reached the pole and gripped its cold metal. It was heavy, but her adrenaline-fueled terror gave her strength. She got to her feet, staggering. She held the pole like a javelin, its weight a comfort, an anchor of solid reality in this world of negation. She chose her target, the nearest puppet, the reanimated form of one of the local laborers. His name was Matty, she remembered, a sudden, sharp pang of guilt piercing her resolve. He had a family in the nearby village. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words lost to the void. She lunged, not with a warrior's grace, but with the clumsy, brute force of desperation. She drove the end of the pole into the puppet's chest. There was no sound of impact, no wet crunch of breaking ribs or desiccated flesh, but the effect was immediate. The puppet was thrown backward, its rigid posture broken, its mouth closed, and a sliver of sound returned. A high-pitched ringing filled Kenna's left ear, a welcome agony. The oppressive pressure lessened by a fraction. The circle was broken. The perfect wave of anti-sound was now flawed, incomplete. The other puppets turned their heads, a slow, synchronized movement, their dead eyes fixed on her. Their silent mouths remained open. They were adapting. They began to shuffle, moving to close the gap in their circle. "Ben!" Kenna screamed, and this time the sound was real, a harsh, ragged croak. The noise seemed to jolt him. His eyes focused. He saw Kenna, the pole, the shambling puppets. He saw the gap. Understanding dawned. He scrambled on all fours, a desperate crab walk through the deep sand, heading for the opening Kenna had created. Kenna pulled the pole free and followed him, turning to face the encroaching circle. They were slow, but they were relentless. They reached the wall of the pit. It was a steep, near-vertical wall of shifting sand, unclimbable. "We can't get up," Ben cried, his voice hysterical. From above, a stream of sand cascaded down, followed by a dark shape. It was Guxa. He had found them. He threw down a thick rope, one end tied around the solid basalt outcrop he had been near before. "The thirst remakes the world." The old man's voice was calm, carried on the now audible wind. "But stone does not change." Kenna and Ben didn't hesitate. Ben went first, hauling his shaking body up the rope. The puppets reached the base of the wall and began to claw at the sand, their movements futile. Their weapon was sound, not strength. Kenna followed, her muscles burning. As she neared the top, she looked back down into the pit. The puppets had stopped trying to climb. They had reformed their circle and resumed their silent song, erasing the space where Kenna and Ben had just been. She collapsed at the top, gasping for air, her ears ringing, her head pounding. The full cacophony of the sandstorm and the choir washed over her again, and she welcomed it like a lover. Any sound was better than the unsound. Guxa was already pulling up the rope. He looked at Kenna, his dark eyes filled with something that might have been pity. "You have heard its whisper," he said. "Now it will want to know you better." Kenna pushed herself to her feet and looked out across the dune. The storm was a churning nightmare, but through a momentary gap in the swirling sand she saw it. On the very highest peak of the dune, a faint, pulsing light emanated, a soft, blue-white glow that was not a reflection and not a fire. It was a beacon in the chaos. "The heart," she breathed, remembering Gux's words. "The quiet place." "It is the eye of the storm," Guxa corrected, "and it is watching us now." The gap in the storm closed, but the image of the light was burned into Kenna's mind. It was a destination, perhaps the only one left. Chapter 7: The Rusting Ark. The cab of the supply truck was a tomb. The windows were opaque, plastered with a thick, gritty film of sand. The only light came from the dashboard, a flickering, sickly green that cast long, dancing shadows. Every few seconds, the main cabin light would attempt to switch on, stuttering with a weak buzz before dying again. The battery was failing. Outside, the scraping had been going on for what felt like hours. A rhythmic, grating sound of fingernails, or what was left of them, being dragged across the truck's metal skin. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny, insistent tortures, a noise designed to fray the nerves and grind down the will. "Make it stop," Lena whispered from the passenger seat. She was curled into a ball, her arms wrapped around her head. "Please, just make it stop." "They're not trying to get in," Rhino said, his voice a low, rough murmur. He was staring at the ceiling, his big hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. They're just tuning it like a bloody guitar. Zara sat behind the wheel, her face set in a grim mask of concentration. She was the anchor, the point of calm in their claustrophobic, metallic world. She had systematically checked every system. The engine was dead, the air intake choked with sand. The radio was a useless box of static. The doors were sealed, and the sand was piled so high against them she doubted they could open them anyway. They were trapped, buried alive in their own rusting ark. "We need a plan," she said, her voice cutting through Lena's quiet sobs. "Staying here is not an option. We are running out of air. The CO2 scrubbers in the cabin are battery-powered." Rhino let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A plan? A plan to do what? Go outside and join the choir. There's nothing out there, Zara, I saw it. There's nothing but them and the sand." "There are the rocks," Zara countered, her gaze unwavering. "The basalt outcrop, it's a kilometer south of our position. It's solid ground. It's a landmark." "And how are we supposed to get there?" Rhino shot back, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "Dig our way out. They'll be waiting for us." Suddenly, the scraping stopped. The silence that replaced it was, for a moment, a relief. Then it became something worse, a waiting, listening silence. Lena sat up, her eyes wide. Why did they stop? And then the new sound began. It was the sound of a child crying. Not a panic scream, but a soft, heartbreaking whimper of a lost and frightened little girl. "Mommy, Daddy, I'm scared. Can you help me?" The voice was crystal clear, coming from just outside the driver's side door. It was a perfect, studio-quality recording of human misery. Zara's blood ran cold. It was a lure, the most obscene, manipulative lure she could imagine. Lena clamped her hands over her ears. "Don't listen," she whimpered. "It's not real, it's the dune." But Rhino was reacting. His whole body had gone rigid. His breathing was shallow. He stared at the driver's side window as if he could see through the caked-on sand. "Rhino," Zara said, her voice low and steady. "It's a trick, don't listen to it." "Anya," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. She sounded just like Anya. Zara's heart sank. She knew a little of Rhino's past, a tragedy, a daughter, a detail she had picked up from a drunken conversation a year ago, a detail she wished she didn't know right now. "Rhino, look at me," she commanded. "Cadden, it's the dune, it's reading us. It's looking for a weakness." "Please," the little girl's voice whimpered from outside. "It's so dark, I'm cold." Rhino's hand moved, inching toward the door handle. His face was a battlefield of grief and logic, and grief was winning. The raw, paternal instinct to protect was overwhelming his soldier's discipline. "Don't you do it," Zara warned, her voice hard as steel. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "Don't you dare open that door." He flinched, turning to look at her. His eyes were wild with pain. "You don't understand. What if? What if it's not the dune? What if it's one of the laborers' kids? Someone who wandered from the village?" "The villages are 50 kilometers away," Zara snapped. "No one is out there, it's a trap." The crying intensified, becoming more desperate. Rhino let out a choked sob. He was losing the fight. His hand closed around the door handle. Zara moved. She didn't have a weapon, but the truck was full of tools. In the space behind her seat was a heavy, four-way tire iron. She grabbed it, the cold, heavy steel a grim comfort in her hand. She stood in the cramped space between the seats, planting her feet. "Cadden," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "if you open that door, I will hit you with this tire iron. I will break your arm. I will knock you unconscious. Do you understand me? I will not let you kill us." He stared at her, then at the tire iron, then back at her. The crying outside reached a fever pitch of manufactured despair. For a long, stretched moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the whimpering from outside and Rhino's ragged breathing. Finally, something in his eyes broke. The wildness receded, replaced by a wave of crushing, hollow grief. He pulled his hand back from the door as if it were red hot. He slumped back in his seat, covering his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The crying outside stopped. Just like the scraping, it simply ceased, as if a switch had been flipped. The listening silence returned. Zara remained standing for another minute, the tire iron held ready, her heart hammering. She slowly lowered it, her own hands trembling from the adrenaline. Lena looked from the weeping man in the front seat to Zara, her expression a mixture of fear and awe. "The battery is almost gone," Zara said, her voice rough. She had to get them focused again. "The lights will die, then the scrubbers. We have about an hour of breathable air after that, maybe less." She pointed to the roof of the cab. "The emergency hatch, it's a manual crank. We go out the top. The sand will be looser up there. We can dig our way out." Rhino looked up, his face streaked with tears and grime. "And then what? They'll be waiting." "Then we run," Zara said, her gaze flinty. "We run for the rocks. We run and we don't look back. We don't listen to anything. We just run." She looked at the GPS display on the dashboard tablet. The battery indicator was a single, flashing red bar, but the map was still there, a faint, ghostly image. "We have a heading. We have a chance. It's the only one we're going to get." She began to turn the manual crank for the roof hatch. It was stiff, protesting with a loud groaning of metal. Each turn was a commitment, an announcement to the waiting silence outside that the occupants of the rusting ark were about to emerge. Chapter 8: Vocaliths. The dune was a landscape of madness. Kenna and Ben struggled through the shifting sands, Guxa leading the way. The old guide moved with an unnerving confidence, his bare feet seeming to find solid purchase where their heavy boots sank. He navigated the impossible geography as if reading a map only he could see. The sandstorm had abated, but the air remained thick with a fine ochre haze. The sky was a bruised, purple-gray ceiling, and the only light came from the strange, pulsing glow at the dune's peak. The song of the choir was a constant, distant thrum behind them, a reminder of the engine of horror they had left behind. "How are you doing this?" Kenna asked Guxa, her voice raw. "How do you know where to walk?" "I do not walk on the sand," Guxa replied without turning. "I walk on the silence between its notes. The great thirst sings a loud song to frighten its prey, but it is an old song. I know the rhythm." His words made no logical sense, but Kenna was long past logic. She simply followed. They were climbing now, moving toward the light. The terrain grew stranger. They passed through a canyon where the sand walls were carved with the same spiraling glyphs as the mummies, massive and intricate. The air here echoed with faint whispers, ghosts of conversations from her own team, sentences spoken just days ago. It was as if the canyon walls had recorded them. Psychic resonance, Ben muttered, his voice shaky. He was walking like an automaton, his eyes darting around, taking in every impossible detail. He was a man drowning in data he could not process. The quartz in the sand, it's acting like a recording medium. The entity's song provides the electrical charge to imprint and replay the sounds. They emerged from the canyon onto a wide, flat plateau just below the final peak. And here they stopped. The plateau was not covered in sand. It was a field of black, glassy stones, half buried in the ground. They were the size of human heads, their surfaces smooth and porous, like obsidian sponges. These were the vocaliths, and they were the source of the whispers. As Kenna drew closer, the sounds became clearer. They were not just echoes of her team. She heard the guttural tones of German, frustrated and afraid. She heard the clicks and songs of a language she recognized as Gux's. She heard the terrified prayers of a lost traveler in what might have been Portuguese. Each stone was a speaker, playing a looped recording of a person's final moments of consciousness. It was a library of last thoughts, a garden of harvested souls. It collects them, Kenna breathed, a profound, chilling understanding settling upon her. It doesn't just consume, it preserves, it studies. Ben walked into the field of stones as if in a trance. He knelt by one of the vocaliths. A woman's voice, speaking a dialect of Coco, emanated from it, a soft, crooning lullaby sung to a child that was not there. Ben reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the stone's surface. His eyes widened. "It's not just sound," he said, his voice filled with a terrible awe. "It's everything, her whole life, I can see it. Her birth, her first steps, the smell of the fire in her village, the face of her son." He gasped, his knuckles white where he gripped the stone. "The fear, the thirst. The moment the dune found her, it's all here. A complete consciousness stored as resonating data." He moved to another stone and another, his hands flitting between them. A German geologist from 1908. He was searching for diamonds. A child who wandered from his tribe 500 years ago. An entire caravan swallowed by a sandstorm in the 17th century. He stood up, turning to Kenna, his face illuminated by the pulsing light from the peak above. "You were wrong, Kenna. This isn't the discovery of the century. It's the discovery of all centuries. It's the Akashic record made manifest, a living library of every mind this entity has ever touched." The look in his eyes terrified her more than the sand puppets had. It was the look of a man who had found God in the heart of a monster. "We have to go," Kenna said, grabbing his arm. "Ben, we have to keep moving." He pulled away from her, his gaze fixed on the glowing peak. "Don't you see? This is what it does. This is its purpose. It's not a predator. It's an archivist. It's saving us from the chaos of life, giving us a perfect, ordered immortality within its memory." Guxa stepped between them. He placed a hand on Ben's chest. "A song that is never forgotten is a song that is never free," the old man said softly. "This is not a library. It is a cage." Before Ben could respond, the light from the peak flared and a new sensation washed over them. It was not a sound. It was a wave of pure comprehension. An image, a feeling, a block of knowledge was inserted directly into their minds. They saw the entity not as a dune, but as it was, a crystalline, symbiotic life form that had journeyed through the void for eons. They saw it crash into the nascent earth, a silent, thinking jewel burying itself deep beneath the rock. They saw millennia pass. They saw the rock erode into sand, and the entity learn to communicate through the vibration of those sands. They saw it touch the minds of the first humans, a curious god exploring the fleeting, noisy thoughts of these ephemeral creatures. And they saw High Priest Akashingo. They saw his tribe dying, their minds being archived by the curious entity. They saw his desperation, his genius. They saw him devise the ritual, creating the choir not as an offering of praise, but as a shackle. A song so complex, so precise, so constant, that it would occupy the entity's entire consciousness, forcing it into a feedback loop, a meditative state that would prevent it from expanding its influence. The choir was a lullaby for a god, designed to keep it dreaming. Kenna fell to her knees, clutching her head as the vision faded. It all made sense. The glyphs, the reinforced larynxes, the conductor. It was an ancient, brilliant piece of acoustic engineering designed to contain a cosmic horror, and she had dismantled it like a curious child breaking her father's watch. She looked at Ben. The vision had not shocked him back to sanity. It had pushed him over the edge. A serene, beatific smile was on his face. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "The ultimate form of existence, pure consciousness. No pain, no fear, just data." He turned and began to walk, not toward the peak but deeper into the field of vocaliths, his hands outstretched, seeking communion. "Ben, no," Kenna screamed. But it was too late. Guxa held her back. "His song is ending," the old man said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You cannot sing it for him." They watched as Ben came to a stop in the center of the plateau. He closed his eyes and stood with his arms open wide, embracing the dune, the song, and the entity. The distant pulse from the conductor seemed to focus on him. His body began to shimmer, to lose its solidity. He became translucent, a figure of vibrating light. Then, with a soft, inaudible pop, he dissolved into a billion motes of light and energy that were absorbed by the surrounding vocaliths. For a moment, a new voice joined the cacophony of whispers. Ben's voice, calmly and clearly explaining the molecular structure of silicate particulates. Then it faded, merging with the chorus of the lost. Kenna stared at the empty space where her friend had been, a hollow, aching void opening inside her. She had not just led him to his death. She had led him to his assimilation. She turned her eyes to the peak. The pulsing light was a challenge, an invitation. Her grief solidified into something hard and cold. Rage. She finally understood the system, and now she was going to find its heart. Chapter 9. The Prophet's Bargain. Jafari pressed himself against the back of the communications tent, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest. The sand puppet, the hollowed-out shell of Imara's assistant, stood in the ripped opening, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its jaw worked silently, a dry clicking sound accompanying a fine trickle of sand from its lips. It was a sentinel, a guard. The flashlight in Jafari's hand trembled, the beam dancing across the dead man's face. He was trapped. He thought of his equipment, of the knowledge he held. This couldn't be the end, to be turned into a dusty marionette in a forgotten corner of the desert. He looked for a weapon, a heavy battery pack, a metal tripod, anything. Then another figure appeared, stepping through the tent opening and moving past the puppet as if it were a piece of furniture. It was Guxa. The old sand guide was completely calm. He didn't even glance at the sand puppet. He walked to the center of the tent and looked at Jafari, his dark eyes seeming to absorb the frantic, dancing beam of the flashlight. "The man of sounds," Guxa said. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through Jafari's panic. "You listen, but you do not yet hear." "Stay back," Jafari stammered, holding the heavy battery pack in front of him like a shield. "How are you? It didn't touch you." Guxa gestured to the sand puppet, which remained unnervingly still. "It knows my family. My blood has known its song for 1,000 years. We are familiar." He then uttered a series of soft clicks and a low, guttural hum. The sand puppet reacted. It slowly turned its head to look at Guxa. It then took a shambling step backward out of the tent and became still once more, resuming its vigil but now facing away from them. Jafari stared, his scientific mind struggling to find a rational explanation and failing utterly. "You can control them." "Control?" Guxa shook his head. "No, one cannot control the tide. One can only know its currents. My ancestors learned the patterns, the sounds of command and the sounds of peace." He looked around at the array of blinking, damaged equipment. "My people were the shepherds of this place. We did not worship the great thirst. We contained it." He walked over to Jafari's main analysis monitor, which was still glowing with the chaotic waveforms of the Dune's song. "Your people came. The Germans with their rifles looking for gold. The surveyors with their maps, drawing lines on a land that does not hold still. Now you, with your listening ears, digging for secrets that were buried for a reason." Jafari slowly lowered the battery pack. "The choir, what is it?" "It is a cage of music," Guxa explained, his words painting a picture of myth and science intertwined. "The one who came before, the wise man Akashingo, he did not build it to please the Dune. He built it to bind it. He learned its true name, its core frequency. He built the choir to sing a song that would hold its mind forever, a lullaby to keep the god asleep." A stunning, terrifying clarity washed over Jafari. The complex polyphonic structure, the harmonic feedback loop. It wasn't a conversation, it was a prison. A perfectly designed, self-sustaining acoustic prison. "And we broke it," Jafari whispered. "When we moved the first mummy, we disrupted the harmony. We introduced a flaw into the perfect loop." "You kicked the sleeping god," Guxa said with grim simplicity. "Now it is awake, it stretches. It learns new things from your minds, the unsound, the voices that lie. Soon it will learn enough to sing a new song, one that will not be contained by this desert, one that will retune the world." Jafari felt a profound sense of cold, a dread that went deeper than the fear for his own life. This was an extinction-level event, and he had been one of its architects. What can we do? Akashingo's ritual is lost to the sand, Guxa said. The knowledge of how to build a new choir is gone, but the core frequency, the true name, that does not change. He tapped a long, wrinkled finger on Jafari's monitor. You hear the noise, the screams, the choir, but you are not hearing the heart, the true sound. The prime frequency, Jafari realized. The fundamental tone that the entire choir was built to contain. It must be in there, buried beneath all this chaos. If I could isolate it. You must, Guxa said, his tone urgent. You must find the heart's song. Why, what good would it do? Akashingo used voices and bone. We must use what we have. Guxa swept a hand around the tent, at the speakers, the amplifiers, the signal generators. You will make a new song, a technological prayer, a signal that can counter the heart, not a cage of many voices, but a single, perfect note of silence. You will sing the unsound back at its own heart. It was insane. It was impossible. A desperate mythological plan based on a foundation of acoustic science. It was the only hope they had. I can't, Jafari said, shaking his head. The main power is out. My equipment is damaged. I don't have enough power to generate a signal strong enough to affect that thing. There is power, Guxa said. He looked toward the unseen camp. The truck, the big one, its engine is dead, but its batteries are strong, and it has a horn, a very loud horn. Jafari's mind raced. The truck's electrical system, the powerful alternator if they could somehow clear the engine, the array of speakers in his own sound equipment, a directional parabolic dish. It was a long shot, a ridiculous, desperate, beautiful long shot. I need to get to the truck, Jafari said, a new fire in his eyes. He was no longer a victim. He was a scientist with a problem to solve. And I need my gear. I will take you, Guxa said. He led Jafari from the tent. The sand puppet stood motionless, ignoring them. The sandstorm had lessened, and the air was filled with the oppressive thrumming of the choir. In the distance, the peak of the dune glowed. Guxa pointed toward it. The doctor, the woman who digs, she goes to the heart. She does not know it, but she is the distraction we need. The god is focused on its new guest. He then looked at Jafari, his eyes intense. She will not survive, but you must. You must listen for the true name, and you must be ready to sing when I tell you. He started off toward the faint, buried outline of the supply truck, a shadow moving through a world of hostile sound. Jafari, grabbing a case of essential electronics, hurried after him. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant in a ritual thousands of years old, a prophet armed with an oscilloscope, ready to do battle with a god. Chapter 10, Heart of Silence. The entrance to the cave was a wound in the dune's peak. It was not a geological formation, but a perfect, smooth-edged orifice that seemed to have been melted into the sand. From within there was no light, only a profound and unnerving silence. The thrum of the choir, the howl of the wind, all of it was gone, cut off as if by a physical barrier. This was the quiet place. Kenna stood at the threshold, her friend's dissolution a fresh, searing scar on her soul. Her rage had cooled, leaving behind a core of diamond-hard resolve. She was no longer a scientist or a victim. She was a witness, and she would see this through to its end. She took a breath of the still, cool air that emanated from the darkness and stepped inside. The floor was not sand. It was a smooth, black, vitreous substance that felt cool beneath her boots. The walls were the same, curving upward into a perfect, vaulted tunnel. It was like walking into the throat of some colossal, glassy beast. Her headlamp beam was swallowed by the darkness, its light seeming to travel only a few feet before being absorbed by the non-reflective walls. She walked deeper, her footsteps making no sound. The silence was absolute, a perfect void that was the antithesis of the unsound she had experienced in the pit. That had been a pressure, an attack. This was a presence, the calm, steady silence of a mind at rest. The tunnel opened into a vast, spherical chamber, and in the center of it she saw the heart. It defied description. It was a floating, crystalline object the size of a car. It was partly translucent, partly obsidian black, with veins of soft, blue-white light pulsing rhythmically within it, like a slow, sleeping heartbeat. It was a matrix, a lattice, a neurological structure of impossible complexity. It was the physical brain of the Chthonian hum. It was the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. As she stared, her mind opened. It was not a violent intrusion, but a gentle unfurling. Thoughts that were not her own flowed into her consciousness. They were not words, but concepts, sensation, data. She felt the cold of interstellar space. She felt the impact with the planet, a jarring shock that lasted for 1,000 years. She felt the slow, patient crawl of geological time as rock wore away to sand around its dormant form. She felt its first, tentative touch on the primitive minds of early life, the confusion of their hot, chaotic emotions of fear and hunger. She saw Akashingo through the entity's own eyes, a brilliant, defiant spark of organized thought. She felt the entity's curiosity as he built the choir, its surprise as the lullaby of the choir's song gently, inexorably, forced its sprawling consciousness into a state of focused dormancy. It had not been imprisoned against its will. It had been fascinated by the elegant, mathematical puzzle of the song and had allowed itself to be absorbed by it. Kenna understood. The entity was not evil. It was not malicious. It was an intelligence so vast and so alien that concepts of good and evil were irrelevant. It was a being of pure resonance, and it had been sleeping. She had been the alarm clock. Her own memories were being drawn from her, not stolen but reviewed. The entity was tasting her ambition, her frustration, her grief for Ben. It was learning her. She felt its immense, ancient loneliness, a being without peer, and in her it had found the most interesting new thought it had encountered in millennia. She was so lost in the psychic communion that she didn't hear the sound at first. A harsh, metallic groan, a roar of a diesel engine, miraculously brought to life. The floor of the chamber vibrated. From somewhere far below and outside, a new noise was intruding upon the perfect silence. In the cab of the supply truck, Zara slammed her foot on the accelerator. The engine, cleared of sand by a frantic rhino while she and Lena stood guard, roared in protest. "Hold on," she yelled. She wasn't trying to drive away. She was using the six-wheel drive, 10-ton vehicle as a battering ram. She slammed it in reverse, crashing through the wall of sand that had buried them. The truck bucked and groaned. She threw it into drive, lurching forward, smashing a path through the sand puppets that had gathered around them. They were thrown aside like dolls, their bodies breaking apart in clouds of dust. Zara wasn't aiming for the desert. She was aiming for the basalt rocks, for the base of the trench, for the heart of the noise. At a new command post a few hundred meters away, hidden behind a sand drift, Jafari watched the waveforms on his laptop, which was now wired into the truck's auxiliary battery. Guxa stood beside him, one hand on Jafari's shoulder. "There," Guxa said, his eyes closed. "The heart is disturbed, it is angry, I can feel its true voice now." Jafari saw it on the screen. A single, pure, incredibly low frequency had appeared beneath all the others. A clean, perfect sine wave, the prime frequency, the true name. "I have it," he shouted, his fingers flying across the keyboard, isolating the signal, analyzing it. "I can build the inverse wave. I can broadcast it through the truck's horn and our main speakers. It will be a focused beam of the unsound." "Do it," Guxa commanded. "Sing the song of silence." Back in the heart chamber, Kenna was thrown from her psychic reverie. The communion was broken. The entity's serene curiosity was replaced by a flash of cosmic irritation. The blue light within the crystal pulsed faster, turning a sharp, angry red. The silence was shattered. A soundless, psychic scream erupted from the crystalline heart, a wave of pure, concentrated rage that struck Kenna like a physical blow. She was thrown backward, skidding across the glassy floor. The images flooding her mind were no longer of stars and time, but of fire and dissolution. The entity was showing her how it would unmake her. Just as her consciousness began to fray under the assault, a new element entered the fray. A jarring, artificial tone, a high-pitched, piercing beep. Jafari's counterfrequency, the unsound. It was not a perfect nullification. He didn't have the power for that, but it was enough. The psychic scream faltered. The pure wave of the entity's anger was being disrupted by Jafari's flawed, desperate, technological shriek. The entity, for the first time in its existence, was experiencing interference. It was feeling pain. The entire dune shuddered. The choir's song outside became chaotic, a dozen mummies hissing and moaning out of tune. The conductor's pulse stuttered. The lullaby was broken. The god was fully, violently awake. The crystal heart flared with an incandescent, white-hot light. The walls of the chamber began to crack. The glassy floor fractured beneath Kenna's feet. The quiet place was about to be destroyed. Kenna looked at the raging, crystalline god and at the spreading cracks in the floor. She saw Zara's truck ramming its way toward the trench below. She heard the faint, heroic beep of Jafari's signal. All the pieces were on the board. The final, desperate battle for the Song of the Earth had begun. Chapter 11. The Song of Rust and Bone. The supply truck was a beast of pure, roaring defiance. Zara gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, her gaze locked on the trench. Sand and debris sprayed from the spinning tires as she charged up the unstable slope of the dune. The choir, its song now a discordant, agonized shriek, was directly ahead. "What are you doing?" Rhino bellowed from the passenger seat, bracing himself against the dashboard. "You're driving us right into them." "Jafari needs a direct line of sight," Zara yelled back over the engine's scream and the choir's cacophony. "The broadcast is directional. We have to get the speakers closer to the source." Lena, huddled in the back, watched in terror as the seated mummies grew larger in the windshield. They were no longer just ancient artifacts. They were the focal point of a sonic war, their hollow chests and open mouths emitting waves of visible, distorted air. The ground shook with the combined force of the raging dune and Jafari's counterfrequency. Jafari, from his makeshift command post, watched the power levels on his laptop fluctuate wildly. "It's not enough," he shouted to Guxa. "The entity is adapting. It's shifting its prime frequency to compensate for my signal. It's like it's learning to ignore the pain." "Then you must change your song," Guxa said, his hand still on Jafari's shoulder, his eyes closed as if he were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. "Do not fight its anger. Join it. Match its new note." Jafari's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a duelist, adjusting his attack in real time. He captured the entity's new frequency and began to modulate his own signal, turning the unsound from a steady tone into a fluctuating, warbling shriek designed to cause maximum interference. The truck hit the edge of the trench. For a moment it teetered, its massive weight defying gravity. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, it crashed down into the pit, landing nose first in the deep sand just meters from the conductor's sarcophagus. The engine sputtered, choked on sand, and died. Silence fell inside the cab, a shocking, sudden absence of mechanical noise. It was replaced by the overwhelming, concentrated shriek of the choir, now surrounding them on three sides. "Everybody out," Zara roared, kicking her door open. "Now move." She leaped from the cab, the tire iron held like a weapon. Rhino and Lena scrambled out after her. They were in the heart of the orchestra from hell. The conductor loomed over them, its body vibrating so intensely it was a blur, the sinew strings in its chest humming with a sound that was low enough to liquefy organs. The seated mummies of the choir turned their heads, a slow, synchronized movement to face the intruders. From the truck's roof, a parabolic dish and a set of powerful speakers, connected by a thick cable that snaked back toward Jafari's position, blasted the warbling unsound directly at the conductor. The two opposing sonic forces met in the air between them, creating a chaotic, violent vortex of sound and silence. The air shimmered. Sand grains hovered, suspended in the null zones between wave crests. The conductor reacted. It focused its energy on the truck, on the source of its annoyance. A low, resonant pulse boomed from its chest, a physical wave of force. The truck's windows shattered inward. The metal body of the vehicle buckled and warped as if struck by a giant, invisible hammer. "The cable," Jafari's voice crackled over Zara's radio. "It's going to destroy the speakers. The connection will be severed." Zara saw it. The thick, armored cable connecting the speakers to Jafari's equipment was stretched taut, vibrating, sparks flying from a damaged section near the truck. She looked at the conductor, then at the seated mummies. They were just instruments, dead, hollowed-out instruments. An idea born of pure, battlefield desperation seized her. "Rhino," she yelled, pointing with the tire iron. "The choir, smash them, break the instruments." Rhino stared at her, his face a mask of confusion. "What? Don't you get it? The conductor is the amplifier, but they are the speakers. If we break them, we can weaken the overall song." She didn't wait for his reply. She charged at the nearest mummy, the one Ben had first examined in the tent. She swung the tire iron with all her strength. The heavy metal bar connected with the mummy's desiccated head. There was no crunch of bone, but a dry, dusty thump, and the head exploded in a cloud of sand, cured skin, and black, obsidian fragments. The effect was instantaneous. The choir's unified shriek faltered. A single note dropped out of the harmony, leaving a discordant, gaping hole in the sound. Rhino's eyes widened in understanding. A savage grin spread across his face. All his grief, all his terror found an outlet. He let out a primal roar and charged at the next mummy in the crescent. He didn't have a weapon, so he used his body, crashing into the seated figure with the force of a battering ram. The ancient ironwood frame splintered, and the mummy toppled, its parchment skin tearing, its song silenced. It became a scene of visceral, primitive fury. Zara and Rhino, two specks of flesh and blood, systematically destroying an ancient, supernatural machine. Zara moved with a cold, brutal efficiency, her tire iron rising and falling. Rhino was a berserker, kicking, punching, tearing the seated figures apart. Lena, frozen for a moment, saw a length of shattered ironwood frame on the ground. She picked it up, her fear replaced by a desperate, cold anger, and joined the fray, bringing the shard down again and again on the nearest silent singer. They were breaking the cage of music, one bar at a time. With each mummy they destroyed, the choir's song grew weaker, more fragmented. The dune itself seemed to groan in protest, the ground shaking, but the focused, weaponized sound was failing. Jafari and Guxa watched from their hiding place. "They are giving you an opening," Guxa urged. "The beast is confused, its many mouths are being broken. Now, Jafari, sing your loudest note, aim for the heart." Jafari rerouted every last amp of power from the truck, dying battery. He bypassed safety limiters, pushing his equipment to the point of self-destruction. He focused the unsound signal, no longer a fluctuating shriek, but a single, pure, piercing beam of absolute acoustic negation, aimed past the trench, past the chaos, and directly at the glowing peak of the dune. It was a sniper shot made of silence. Chapter 12, The Last Note. The heart chamber was disintegrating. Kenna was on her feet, scrambling for purchase on the fracturing glass floor. The crystalline entity, the heart of the dune, was raging. Freed from the choir's lullaby and assaulted by Jafari's signal, its consciousness was a storm of pure, chaotic energy. The psychic scream it emitted was no longer focused on Kenna. It was an omnidirectional blast of existential fury. The walls of the chamber bled light, the smooth black surfaces cracking to reveal the incandescent, white-hot energy of the entity's core. The very structure of the dune was coming apart. Kenna knew she had seconds before the entire peak collapsed, burying her in a tomb of sand and cosmic rage. Then Jafari's signal changed. The warbling interference was replaced by a single, focused beam of the unsound. It did not strike the chamber with a physical impact. Instead, a perfect, spherical zone of silence bloomed in the center of the room, centered on the crystalline heart. The entity's psychic scream was instantly, utterly nullified. The raging, white-hot light within the crystal faltered, turning a confused, sickly yellow. The entity recoiled from the silence as a living thing would recoil from a flame. It was a being of pure resonance. A perfect void was the ultimate poison, the ultimate counteragent to its very existence. Kenna felt the shift. The rage was gone, replaced by a feeling of profound alien panic. The god was vulnerable. The god was afraid. An opportunity, a final desperate suicidal chance. She looked at the fracturing floor, then at the panicked, crystalline mind before her. She understood what she had to do. This thing could not be allowed to recover. It could not be allowed to adapt. She had started this. She would finish it. She ran. Her boots slid on the treacherous, cracking floor, but her focus was absolute. She ran directly toward the floating crystal heart, toward the expanding bubble of Jafari's perfect silence. The entity sensed her approach. It turned its panicked attention to her, the insignificant mote of flesh and thought that had caused all this. It tried to lash out, to unmake her, but its power was being canceled out by the unsound. It was like a giant trying to swat a fly while being deafened and blinded. Kenna reached the edge of the silent zone. She took one last, deep breath of the vibrating, superheated air and plunged into the void. The sensation was absolute. Her own heartbeat vanished. The rush of air, the scrape of her boots, the frantic pumping of her own blood, all gone. She was in a world without sound, without vibration. And in the center of it was the crystal, now pulsing a dull, dying red. She reached it. She placed her hands on its surface. It was not hot or cold. It had no physical temperature. But through her hands, she felt the last vestiges of its ancient, lonely consciousness. It was a torrent of pure data, the memories of 1 billion years, the recorded souls of 1,000 victims, all screaming in terror as they were erased by the encroaching void. And in that final moment, she offered it a thought, not a challenge, not an attack, a single, pure concept, the most complex and powerful idea her species had ever produced. She gave it the memory of Ben's sacrifice, of Zara's courage, of Gux's wisdom. She gave it the concept of empathy. For an infinitesimal fraction of a second, the entity's panic ceased. It focused on this new, impossible data. This idea that one part of a system could willingly sacrifice itself for the good of the whole. This was a thought more alien to it than the silence that was killing it. And in that moment of hesitation, of pure, analytical curiosity, its defenses dropped completely. Jafari's unsound, amplified by the sacrifice of the truck's batteries and the focused rage of its operators, hit the entity's core frequency with perfect, unadulterated precision. The crystal did not explode. It did not shatter. It simply ceased to be. The red light vanished. The psychic presence was gone. The heart of the great thirst, the Chthonian hum was erased from existence. The silence ended. The unsound beam, its target gone, faded as Jafari's equipment finally overloaded and died. A profound, natural quiet fell over the dune. Kenna was thrown back as the chamber around her collapsed. The glassy floor gave way, and she plunged into darkness, into a cascade of soft, silent sand. Down below, the war was over. Zara, Rhino, and Lena stood amidst the wreckage of the choir, their chests heaving, their bodies bruised and bleeding. The shriek of the mummies had been replaced by the whisper of the wind. The oppressive, mind-bending hum was gone. The air felt thin, clean. The dune shuddered one last time, a final, convulsive tremor. The entire peak, hollowed out and destabilized, collapsed inward, burying the heart chamber and the woman who had faced it under 1,000,000 tons of sand. Jafari and Guxa watched the mountain settle. The angry, glowing light was gone. The dune was just a dune again, a silent, sleeping mountain of ordinary sand. Jafari looked at his laptop screen. It was a flat line, no signal, no resonance, nothing. "It's over," he breathed. Guxa placed a hand on his shoulder. "A new song has ended. A very old silence has returned." They made their way to the trench. They found the other three standing in the ruin of their own making. The 5 survivors looked at each other, their faces caked in grime and lit by the gentle, indifferent light of the rising sun. They had survived. They had won. But the cost was etched on every face. Ben was gone. Kenna was gone. The world was safe, but their small part of it had been irrevocably broken. Zara looked toward the collapsed peak. Did she? No one had an answer. Guxa walked to the center of the trench and knelt. He scooped up a handful of the reddish sand. He let it run through his fingers. It was just sand now, warm, inert, and silent. "Her song is part of the silence now," he said, his voice soft. "A good place to rest." He stood and looked at the survivors, at the broken machines and the ruined choir. "The world does not know what you have done here. It will not thank you, but the silence will remember." He turned and began to walk away, his figure a small, dark shape against the vast, empty canvas of the desert. He did not look back. His work and the work of his ancestors was finally done. The remaining 4, the soldier, the medic, the scholar, and the student, were left alone in the quiet dawn, surrounded by the wreckage of a god they had helped to kill, forever bound by the terrible, secret song they had shared. Chapter 13, Epilogue: The Weight of Silence. The sun rose on a landscape of profound stillness. The air, stripped of its oppressive hum, felt unnervingly thin. The silence was not the gentle quiet of the desert dawn. It was a vacuum, an absence where a terrible presence had once been. The dune stood before them, a mountain of sand like any other, its peak a broken crown against the pale sky. It looked inert, mundane, innocent. The 4 of them stood in the wreckage of the trench, surrounded by the splintered wood and torn parchment of the choir. The bodies of the sand puppets had collapsed into simple, tragic heaps of flesh and dust, their animating force gone. The supply truck was a crippled metal carcass, its horn and speakers silent. It was a battlefield after the war, and the scale of their victory felt infinitesimally small against the vastness of their loss. It was Zara who broke the silence. Her voice was a dry rasp, practical even in the face of the apocalypse. "Water," she said. "We gather all the water we can find, and food. The walk back to the road is over 100 kilometers. We start now." There were no arguments, there was no discussion. There was only a grim, shared understanding. They moved like automatons, salvaging what they could from the ruined camp. They found sealed water canisters, protein bars, a medical kit. Jafari recovered a single ruggedized hard drive from his shattered equipment, its casing cracked but its contents hopefully intact. He said nothing, simply clutching it to his chest as if it were a holy relic. Rhino, moving with a heavy, deliberate slowness, found a compass and a satellite phone in Zara's truck. The phone was dead, its battery drained in the final, desperate power surge, but the compass was a small miracle of analog reliability. They did not speak of Kenna or Ben. They did not look toward the collapsed peak or the field of silent vocaliths. The grief was too large, the horror too raw. To speak of it would be to give it a reality they could not bear. They were four people bound by a secret that had no words. The walk was a silent pilgrimage through hell. The sun beat down, and the heat rose in shimmering waves from the sand. They walked in a single file line, each lost in their own private aftermath. Zara in the lead focused on the mechanics of survival. Left foot, right foot. Check the compass. Ration the water. She was a machine of logistics because to stop, to think, to truly process the memory of the little girl's voice outside the truck would be to shatter. Rhino walked behind her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The berserker rage that had fueled him in the trench was gone, leaving a profound, hollow emptiness. He had faced the ghost of his daughter and with Zara's help had not succumbed. He had smashed the instruments of a god. He was a man who had fought a nightmare and somehow won, but he wore the victory like a shroud. The boisterous, confident soldier was buried somewhere back in the sand. Lena stumbled along, her eyes shielded by sunglasses and a scarf. She, who had come to the desert seeking the wonder of the past, had found only a monstrous, living truth. The feeling of the ironwood club in her hands, the dry, dusty impact as she destroyed a seated mummy, it was a tactile memory that would never leave her. She would never look at a historical artifact the same way again. She would forever see the potential for a hidden, terrible song. And Jafari, clutching his hard drive, walked last. He was the one who truly understood the scale of what had happened. He had heard the true name of a cosmic being. He had fought a battle of acoustics and physics against a mythological horror. His world, once defined by the clean, predictable laws of science, was now a place of infinite, terrifying possibility. The silence of the desert was not empty to him. It was a canvas, and he feared what new sound might one day be painted upon it. They walked for 2 days. On the third day, a distant glint of light on the horizon resolved into the shape of a vehicle. A patrol from the Namibian Park Service, sent to investigate why Imara Diop's team had gone silent. The 4 survivors huddled together as the land cruiser approached, the dust of its arrival a stark contrast to the silence they had grown accustomed to. As the rangers stepped out, their faces a mixture of concern and suspicion, Zara spoke for the group. Her voice was steady, her story well rehearsed in the long, silent hours of their trek. There was a storm, she said, her lips cracked and bleeding. A freak sandstorm, unbelievable intensity, the trench, our main excavation site, it collapsed. A geological event, a subsidence. Everyone, Dr. O'Connell, Dr. Carter, Imara's team, they were all in the pit. It happened so fast. We were at the vehicles. We were the only ones who made it out. It was a simple, plausible lie, a tragedy, an accident. It was the story they would tell the investigators, the embassy, the university. It was the story they would tell for the rest of their lives. It was the anchor of reality they would cling to, a shield against the screaming, impossible truth. 1 year later, the silence had followed them home. Zara Vinter now managed a small, hydroponic farm in the green, rolling hills of the Western Cape. She worked with her hands in the soil, surrounded by the quiet hum of water pumps and the rustle of growing leaves. She had not been in a desert since. She had not worked an expedition. People who knew her now saw a calm, capable woman who was fiercely protective of her quiet life. But at night, when the wind blew just right through the eaves of her small house, she would sometimes hear a faint, high-pitched whine, and she would lie awake until dawn, the phantom weight of a tire iron in her hand. Cadden Rhino, Rue lived in a small cottage on the coast, working as a mechanic on fishing trawlers. The loud, confident man was gone, replaced by a quiet, gentle giant who rarely spoke. He had a dog, a stray he'd found on the docks, and he would spend his evenings sitting on his porch, watching the endless, rhythmic crash of the waves. He never spoke of his daughter, Anya, again. He didn't need to. He had faced her ghost in the desert, and now he was content to simply listen to the uncomplicated, honest song of the sea. Lena Sharma left academia entirely. She worked as an archivist in the cool, silent basement of a national library, a world of paper and ink and recorded history. She was surrounded by the voices of the past, but they were safe, trapped on the page, their songs forever muted. Her colleagues knew her as a meticulous, almost obsessive worker who insisted on perfect quiet. They did not know that in absolute silence, she could sometimes feel a pressure in her ears, a faint, phantom echo of the unsound, and she would have to flee the archives for the noisy, chaotic reality of the city streets. Jafari Adebio was the only one who had not sought peace. He had become a ghost in the world of academia, resigning his university post and using his savings to build a private, state-of-the-art acoustic laboratory in the basement of his home. The lab was soundproofed, a black-walled anechoic chamber that was one of the quietest rooms on the planet. He spent his days and nights surrounded by screens, analyzing data from the hard drive he had salvaged, and from a new, secret obsession. He had tapped into a network of global sensors, deep-sea hydrophones, Antarctic seismic stations, radio telescopes aimed at the void. He was listening. He believed the Chthonian hum had not been a unique life form. It was a signal, a resonance, a song that had found a perfect instrument in the Namibian dune. What if there were other instruments, other places on Earth or beyond that were capable of receiving the same terrible music? It was on a Tuesday, late at night, that he found it. He was analyzing a deep-sea audio feed from a hydrophone array in the Mariana Trench, a place of immense pressure and absolute darkness. For weeks, There had been nothing but the slow groans of tectonic plates and the faint clicks of unknown abyssal creatures. But now there was something new. It was faint, barely distinguishable from the background noise of the planet, a deep, resonant hum, a single, pure, incredibly low frequency. Jafari's hands trembled as he isolated the signal. He ran a comparative analysis, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The waveform appeared on his main screen. It was a clean, perfect sine wave. It was identical. The true name. Down in the deepest, most inaccessible trench on the planet, something had started to hum. A new choir was waking up. A new instrument was tuning itself. Jafari leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. The silence of his lab was absolute, but he was no longer alone. He had killed a god in the desert, but he had not killed the song. He had only succeeded in changing the station. And across the vast, dark expanse of the world, a new performance was about to begin. The end.